In Kierden we can see that the normal aggressive FJ element in male sexuality has been pushed to a point where it has totally replaced the ordinary desire for penetration. He had admitted to the doctor, Karl Berg, that he kept looking at the white throat of the stenographer who was taking down his confessions, and wishing he could throttle it. Most sex-pound maniacs would only have thought about undressing her. So what we are dealing with here is not sex crime in the usual sense of the word, but a crime which almost deserves a new classification. Bearing in mind Melvin Reinhardt's mutilation madness, we might almost call it destruction madness. The point may be underlined by reference to a curious case of the early 1900s, the Great Whirly Mystery. In 1903 there was a series of mutilations of animals in the area of Great Whirly in Staffordshire. Someone was creeping up on the animals in the night and cutting open their bellies with a razor or very sharp knife. Horses, sheep, cows, and a pony were butchered in this way. Suspicion fell on a 27-year-old solicitor, George Adelji, son of a Parsi clergyman, against whom there was a great deal of racial discrimination. There was also a series of gloating Jack the Ripper type letters to the police. Adelji was convicted on circumstantial evidence, mud on his shoes and alleged horsehairs on his coat, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Released for good conduct after 3 years, he appealed to Conan Doyle for help. Doyle went to Great Whirly, and conducted a careful investigation after the manner of his own Sherlock Holmes. This not only convinced him that the frail, short-sighted Adelji must be innocent, but that the culprit was an ex-schoolfellow of Adelji's called Royden Sharp. The British establishment stood firm and refused to reconsider the case, but Doyle's articles excited so much public indignation that the result was the creation of the Court of Criminal Appeal. Whoever mutilated the cattle also perpetrated on the Reverend Adelji a series of malicious hoaxes, ordering expensive goods in his name and placing advertisements in newspapers signed by the clergyman, but it is also apparent that he was a sadist in the same sense as Kierden and Jack the Ripper. The cattle mutilations were not an attempt at a hoax, they were performed for pleasure, although Anonymous letters then blamed Adelji. Although Doyle built up a watertight case against Royden Sharp, including the evidence of a handwriting expert that the Ripper letters were in Sharp's handwriting, there was no prosecution. So it is to Sharp that we should look for instructive parallels about Jack the Ripper. Sharp had been expelled from school in Walsall at the age of 13 for forgery and destructive tendencies. He loved using a knife. On the way to school by train he would turn over cushions and slice open the underside so that the horsehair emerged. He would also cut the leather straps on the windows. When he left school he was apprenticed to a butcher. A schoolmate he detested was deluged with anonymous letters. In 1895 he went to sea, and Doyle discovered that whenever Sharp was 326 FNI** and 4, at sea, the malicious hoaxes and anonymous letters ceased. The animal mutilations all occurred when Sharp was at home between voyages. Sharp had worked on a cattle ship, from which he obtained a large and sharp instrument known as a horse lancet. Conan Doyle succeeded in getting possession of it. Doyle established that the shallow and sea scions in the animals' bellies must have been made with a similar instrument. And he himself began to receive anonymous letters as soon as he began to defend Adelji publicly, letters in the same handwriting as all the other anonymous letters. So if, as seems highly probable, the Jack the Ripper postcards to Mr. Lusk and the Central News Agency were written by the Whitechapel murderer, then we should probably be looking for a man with some characteristics in common with Royden Sharp, a juvenile delinquent type with a strong streak of malice and a fascination with knives and cutting instruments. If, in fact, Sharp had been in his 20s in 1888 instead of a schoolboy, he would be the ideal suspect for the Ripper murders, since nothing is more likely than that such a person would graduate from killing animals to killing fallen women, as Peter Kierden graduated from torturing animals to killing human beings. It is also interesting to note that Sharp was unable to resist boasting about his attacks. In 1903, a friend of the Sharp family, Mrs. Emily Smallking, went to call at their cottage. She spoke of the cattle mutilations to Sharp, who took a large horse lancet from a cupboard and said, "Look, this is what they kill cattle with." Mrs. Small King reported this to Doyle, who included it in his dossier on the case. Sharp spoke with a kind of gleeful malice, evidently enjoying shocking Mrs. Small King, the same kind of gleeful malice we find in the Ripper letters. All this should at least make it clear that the kind of person who committed the Whitechapel murders was not a brilliant but unbalanced surgeon, or a misogynistic poet, or a cricket-playing barrister, or even a retired army officer who practiced ritual magic, but a malicious overgrown schoolboy who had probably been in trouble for as long as he could remember. Other cases of sex crime can offer us fragmentary clues about the psychology of Jack the Ripper. Earl Nelson, born in Philadelphia in 1897, went on a rampage of murder and rape between February 1926 and November 1927, killing 22 women. Nelson's mother died when he was a baby and he was brought up by an aunt. At the age of 10 he was knocked down by a tramcar and was unconscious for 6 days. For the rest of his life he suffered from headaches. Soon after his 21st birthday, he tried to rape a child in a basement, and was sent to prison. He escaped several times, and in the following year married a young schoolteacher who knew him as Roger Wilson. He proved to be a difficult husband, screaming at his wife a great deal, beating her, and accusing her of infidelity on the slightest pretext. When she had a nervous breakdown, he visited her in hospital and forced her to have intercourse. Interrupted by a doctor, he accused him of having an affair with his wife, then left. Nelson disappears from sight for the next 6 years. But in February 1926 he called at a San Francisco boarding house to inquire about a room. The 60-year-old landlady showed him to an empty room, and was strangled and raped. 10 days later, another 60-year-old landlady was strangled and raped in San Jose. In June, 2 more women were murdered in the same manner. In October, 3 women were murdered in 3 days. In November there were victims in San Francisco, Seattle, and Oregon City. 2 days before Christmas a 49-year-old woman was strangled and raped in Council Bluffs, Iowa. 2 days after Christmas, he strangled a 23-year-old woman, then a 28-year-old woman and her 8-month-old baby girl. Both were violated. During the next 5 months there were 5 more victims in Detroit, 2 in the same lodging house. Then the guerrilla murderer, as the press now called him, crossed into Canada. In Winnipeg he took a room in the house of Mrs. Hill, and quickly lured a 14-year-old girl called Lola Cowan to his room. Lola was found 328 days later after Nelson had left under his bed, her body badly mutilated. Nelson had slept with her under his bed for 3 days. He called on another landlady, Mrs. Emily Patterson, killed her with a hammer and raped her. Her husband found her body later when he went on his knees beside the bed to pray. Mrs. Patterson was Nelson's last victim. He was recognized from his description in the post office at Wacopa, and arrested. He was hanged in Winnipeg in January 1928. 2 interesting points emerge. One was that Nelson was an extremely jealous and violent husband, who finally caused his wife to have a nervous breakdown. The other is that most of the murders and rapes were committed in a hurry, like Jack the Ripper's murders. Although on occasions when he felt he was not likely to be interrupted he violated the body more than once. But on the one occasion when he no longer felt in a hurry, with the body of Lola Cowan concealed in his room, he mutilated the body to such an extent that it was unrecognizable as Jack the Ripper mutilated Mary Kelly, J.J. We can infer that when Nelson's urge was allowed to satisfy itself at leisure, it ran to mutilation madness, exactly like that of the Ripper. We can also observe that the majority of Nelson's victims were elderly women, many in their 60s, suggest wanting a revenge motive against a mother figure. Since his mother died when he was very young, it may be safe to infer that the mother figure was the aunt who brought him up, the highly religious Mrs. Lily Fabian. Nelson liked to pose as a religious man, which explains why so many landladies trusted him. but Mrs. Fabian was also young enough to have an attractive young daughter, Rachel, at whom Nell's son peeped through keyholes. After one of his prison escapes he was found outside her bedroom window, watching her undress. The mother revenge motive can be found in many cases of sexual murder, and it may be significant that in one of his murders Jack the Ripper removed the uterus. In fact, all the mutilations suggest that the Ripper's basic obsession was with the womb, and therefore that he was a man who had reason to hate his mother. Yet if this is so, then the destruction of the womb suggests a basic suicidal urge. In his classic study The Sexual Criminal, Paul de River, a Los Angeles criminologist, analyses a case of a Ripper-type killer, whom he calls K. K, who killed 2 prostitutes, leaving them mutilated and disemboweled. The first victim was left in much the same state as Mary Kelly. In fact, he went further and disarticulated both her arms and legs. He had been placed in an orphanage at the age of 6, and hardly knew his mother, although he was 15 when she died. He had contracted both syphilis and gonorrhea, and was a heavy smoker and drinker. He was also bisexual, but there was no sadistic element in his relations with men, with whom he performed mutual fellatio. He admitted, "I have more satisfaction from females." He had been married, and had threatened his wife with a knife and cut her on the buttock with a safety razor blade. He claimed that he had first experienced the urge to destroy women 4 years before, and had contracted venereal disease since, so the two were not directly connected. De River makes it clear that K is not insane, or even apparently abnormal. He likes people. He has no enemies. He is not antisocial, has no illusions, delusions, or hallucinations. He is cooperative and polite and fairly well orientated as to time, places, dates and persons. His insight and judgment are good. His wealth of knowledge is good for one of his education. But it seems obvious that K himself was unable to understand his desire to mutilate women. "I don't know what made me do it. I was completely insane." He went on to describe how he had bought a knife when he was drunk, then picked up the prostitute and went up to her room. Then, after an act of oral sex, he throttled her unconscious, and stabbed her. Then he went into a frenzy and mutilated the body. From his own account of the murder, it is strangely difficult to understand why he did it, except that when he was drunk, his sexual excitement drove him to perverse lengths, and 330 sexual desire somehow became mixed up with a deep resentment of his mother. It is scarcely necessary to say that if K, whose real name was Wilson, had remained uncaught, and had committed 2 or 3 more murders, he would have remained a horrible legend in Los Angeles, as Jack the Ripper was in London. Yet he was an extremely ordinary little man, aged 34, an ex-soldier and a laborer who, apart from his mutilation madness, was in every way normal. De River says of him that he was a pitiless, ruthless sadist who in his mind entertained but one thought, namely murder and the dissection of his victims. They were the victims of a playful, sadistic dissectionist, the objects of the caprices of a butcher. He was not a rapist. He was highly perverted with a lust for murder. He denied sexual intercourse with either victim, and his was not the action of a man seeking the gratification of his general sexual impulse. He sought above all the satisfaction of an urge to kill and to destroy the object that was once symbolic of love. Here, one suspects, we have an accurate psychological portrait of Jack the Ripper. K was finally executed. If, in fact, Jack the Ripper shared with K a lust for murder that was unconnected with a desire for normal sexual intercourse, then it could be misleading to classify him with most sex killers. Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, left many of his 13 victims in obscene positions, with bite marks on their bodies and objects like a wine bottle inserted into their vaginas, and some were stabbed repeatedly. Yet the basic motivation was always sex. And although many of the victims were elderly women, DeSalvo was extremely fond of his mother. His motivation was a raging sexual hunger. The same seems to be true of Albert Fish, the American child murderer, A polymorphous pervert who cooked and ate his last victim. One of the few American murder cases that seems to offer a true parallel to the crimes of Jack the Ripper is the Cleveland Torso Killer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Between 1935 and 1938, the Mad Butcher killed a dozen men and women, sometimes two at a time, and left their bodies in chopped-up piles. He usually removed the heads, and in half a dozen cases these were never found. Most of the victims were derelicts and prostitutes, and the killer, like Kay, was clearly bisexual. Cleveland's public safety director Eliot Ness finally came to suspect a well-to-do young man who owned his own house and motor car, reasoning that the butcher must have had a place where he could work undisturbed for many hours dismembering his victims, and some means of transporting their bodies to the places where they were found. The man was aware that he was under suspicion and, according to Ness's chronicler Oscar Fraley, took a kind of sneering pleasure in being able to outwit the police. Just as Ness thought he had enough evidence to arrest him, the suspect had himself confined in a mental asylum. The murders stopped, but Ness received a series of postcards jeering about his failure to catch the Mad Butcher. These ceased when the suspect died. Here we have touched again on one of the most important elements in the Ripper psychology, and a key to the morbid fascination they continue to inspire. Melvin Reinhardt, writing about the 17-year-old sadist who killed and dismembered an 8-year-old boy, remarked, "His ego is of the sort that demands cruelty," and added the significant comment, "It seemed as if he were saying, 'Now I am even.'" The Jack the Ripper crimes also seem to suggest the feeling of a man who is shaking his fist at society. Even the words "dear boss" seem to convey a sneer at authority. There is one theory of the Ripper's motivation that seems to be as likely as any. One of the mysteries of the case is how he succeeded in killing his victims so silently, sometimes, as in the case of Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, within a few yards of people who were lying asleep with open windows. We have so far made the assumption that the Ripper was a sadistic maniac who was only interested in murder and mutilation. Yet we know that even a habitual sadist like Peter Kierden often had normal 332V sexual intercourse with women he picked up. We also know that he often squeezed the throats of these women in the act of intercourse, and that many of them seemed to feel that this was perfectly natural, and were even willing to go out with Kierden again. Could this not also explain how the Ripper killed his victims so silently? We may presume that, when his victims accompanied him into some dark corner, they assumed that his only interest was in sexual intercourse. They would probably raise their own clothing, and lie down on the ground. The woman would have felt no alarm if, as the man was lying on top of her, he raised his hands to her throat. Francis Camps is on record as believing that the Ripper strangled his victims before killing them. Or he may, like Kierden, only have squeezed their throats until they lost consciousness. We may also recall the letter received by Daniel Farson from a man who signed himself G.W.B., who declared that his father, an ordinary laborer, had confessed to being Jack the Ripper and told his son that he experienced the urge to kill prostitutes when he was drunk. This again rings true. There are many cases on record of men who, like Rivers K, experience the sadistic urge after drinking heavily. The Ripper may have been a man of this type, an ordinary laborer who made a habit of picking up prostitutes whenever he had money in his pocket, and who was carried away by mutilation madness when he was drunk. All this only underlines the point already made, that the chief mistake of Ripperologists may be in assuming that Jack the Ripper was some kind of criminal genius, a cunning madman who was able to convince those who knew him that he was a perfectly normal individual, who only became abnormal when he was very drunk. Possibly this explains why the murders stopped. A sadistic killer like Earl Nelson or Peter Sutcliffe feels the compulsion to go on killing until he is caught. But a man who knows that he becomes virtually insane when he drinks too much has another choice: to give up getting drunk. Reformed sex murderers are rare, but the world is full of reformed alcoholics. A final comment on the peculiar fascination that the Ripper has continued to exercise for the past century. In A New Theory of Human Evolution, Sir Arthur Keith suggests that man's tribal ancestors had two basic codes of conduct, which he calls the code of amity and the code of enmity. They felt amity towards members of their own tribe, and enmity towards strangers. Up to the time of the Ripper, the code of amity had prevailed in Victorian society, in spite of its inequalities symbolized by the music hall comedian with the battered hat pretending to be a toff. There were, of course, certain people who did not share the code of amity, people like Karl Marx, who longed to see the gutters running with blood and the bourgeoisie hanging from lampposts. But the Victorian poor were deeply shocked by such proposals, and felt that it was the revolutionnaises who deserved to hang from lampposts. With Jack the Ripper, it was as if the code of enmity had arrived with a vengeance. All societies have been plagued with crime, ever since the earliest cities in Mesopotamia, but the criminal always took care not to flaunt his activities. He operated in secret, as befits a parasite. This maniacal killer represented a new attitude. He seemed to be screaming his defiance at the forces of law and order. And everyone, from members of parliament to costermongers and prostitutes, felt that his attitude embodied a new kind of threat to society. Karl Marx had talked about alienation, but Jack the Ripper symbolized it. He seems to represent the beginning of our modern age, with its terrorists who plant bombs in crowded railway stations, its motiveless serial killers who leave a trail of bodies behind them, its sadistic rapists searching for the ideal sex slave. The crimes form a watershed between an age of innocence and an age of violence. It is because we instinctively recognize this that the Ripper murders continue to arouse a feeling of uneasy fascination. 334 Appendix 2 Sir Melville Macnaghten's notes the case referred to in the sensational story told in The Sun in its issue of 13th INST, and following dates, is that of Thomas Cutbush, who was arraigned at the London County Sessions in April 1891, on a charge of maliciously wounding Florence Grace Johnson, and attempting to wound Isabel Fraser Anderson in Kennington. He was found to be insane and sentenced to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure. This Cutbush, who lived with his mother and aunt at 14 Albert St. Kennington, escaped from the Lambeth Infirmary, after he had been detained there only a few hours, as a lunatic, at noon on March 5, 1891. He was rearrested on 9th idem. A few weeks before this, several cases of stabbing, or jabbing from behind had occurred in the vicinity, and a man named Collicutt was arrested, but subsequently discharged owing to faulty identification. Cuts in the girls' dresses made by Collicutt were quite different to the cut made by Cutbush, when he wounded Miss Johnson, who was no doubt influenced by a wild desire of morbid imitation. Cutbush's antecedents were inquired into by C.H. Inspare, now superintendent, unreadable, by Inspare. Race, and by P.S. McCarthy C.I.D., the last named officer had been specially employed in Whitechapel at the time of the murders there, and it was ascertained that he was born, and had lived in Kennington all his life. His father died when he was quite young, and he was always a spoiled child. He had been employed as a clerk and traveller, TPH number at THF Minrips. And subsequently canvassed, for a directory in the East End, during which time he bore a good character. He apparently contracted syphilis about 1888, and, since that time, led an idle and useless life. His brain seems to have become affected, and he believed that people were trying to poison him. He wrote to Lord Grimthorpe and others, and also to the Treasury, complaining of Dr. Brooks, of Westminster Bridge RD, whom he threatened to shoot for having supplied him with bad medicines. He is said to have studied medical books by day, and to have rambled about at night, returning frequently with his clothes covered with blood, but little reliance could be placed on the statements made by his mother or his aunt, who both appear to have been of a very excitable disposition. It was found impossible to ascertain his movements on the nights of the Whitechapel murders. The knife found on him was bought in Houndsditch about a week before he was detained in the infirmary. Cutbush was a nephew of the late superintendent executive. Now the Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims and 5 victims only. His murders were, August 31, 88. Mary Ann Nichols at Bucks Row, who was found with her throat cut and with slight stomach mutilation. 2. 8 September 88. Annie Chapman, Hanbury Street, throat cut, stomach and private parts badly mutilated and some of the entrails placed round the neck. 3. 30 September 88. Elizabeth Stride, Berners Street, throat cut, but nothing in shape of mutilation attempted, and on same date Catherine Eddowes, Mitre Square, throat cut, and very bad mutilation, both of face and stomach. 4. November 9. Mary Jane Kelly, Miller's Court, throat cut, and the whole of the body mutilated in the most ghastly manner. The last murder is the only one that took place in a room, and the murderer must have been at least 2 hours engaged. A photo was taken of the woman, as she was found lying on the bed, without seeing which it is impossible to imagine the awful mutilation. With regard to the double murder which took place on 30 September, there is no doubt but that the man was disturbed by some Jews who drove up to a club, close to which the body of Elizabeth Stride was found, and that he then, 336 if M3KR3, I mortem satiatus, went in search of a further victim whom he found at Mitre Square. It will be noticed that the fury of the mutilations increased in each case, and, seemingly, the appetite only became sharpened by indulgence. It seems, then, highly improbable that the murderer would have suddenly stopped in November 88, and been content to recommence operations by merely prodding a girl behind some 2 years and 4 months afterwards. A much more rational theory is that the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he immediately committed suicide, or, as a possible alternative, was found to be so hopelessly mad by his relations, that he was by them confined in some asylum. No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer. Many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on anyone. I may mention the cases of 3 men, any one of whom would have been more likely than Cutbush to have committed the series of murders. 1. A Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor and of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, and whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on 31 December. Or about 7 weeks after that murder. He was sexually insane, and from private info I have little doubt but that his own family believed him to have been the murderer. 2. Kozminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There were many crimes connected with this man which made him a strong suspect. 3. Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor, and a convict, who was frequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. And now with regard to a few of the inaccuracies and misleading statements made by The Sun. In its issue of February 14, it is stated that the writer has in his possession a facsimile of the knife with which the murders were committed. This knife, which for some unexplained reason has, for the last 3 years, been kept by Innsbruck, instead of being sent to prisoners' property store, was traced, and it was found to have been purchased in Houndsditch in February 91, or 2 years and 3 months after the Whitechapel murders ceased. The statement, too, that Cutbush spent a portion of the day in making rough drawings of the bodies of women, and of their mutilations, is based solely on the fact that 2 scribble drawings of women in indecent postures were found torn up in Cutbush's room. The head and body of one of these had been cut from some fashion plate, and legs were added to show a woman's naked thighs and pink stockings. In the issue of 15th INST, it is said that a light overcoat was among the things found in Cutbush's house, and that a man in a light overcoat was seen talking to a woman in Beckchurch Lane whose body with arms attached was found in Pynchon St. This is hopelessly incorrect. On 10 September 89 the naked body, with arms, of a woman was found in some sacking under a railway arch in Pynchon St. The head and legs were never found nor was the woman ever identified. She had been killed at least 24 hours before the remains, which had seemingly been brought from a distance, were discovered. The stomach was split up by a cut, and the head and legs had been severed in a manner identical with that of the woman whose remains were discovered in the Thames, in Battersea Park, and on the Chelsea embankment on June 4 of the same year, and these murders had no connection whatever with the Whitechapel horrors. The Rainham mystery in 1887, and the Whitehall mystery, when portions of a woman's body were found under what is now Scotland Yard, in 1888 were of a similar type to the Thames and Pynchon St. crimes. It is perfectly untrue to say that Cutbush stabbed 6 girls 338. Behind this is confounding his case with that of Coley-Cut. The theory that the Whitechapel murderer was left-handed, or, at any rate, ambidextrous, had its origin in the remark made by a doctor who examined the corpse of one of the earliest victims. Other doctors did not agree with him. With regard to the 4 additional murders ascribed by the writer in The Sun to the Whitechapel fiend, 1. The body of Martha Tabram, a prostitute, was found on a common staircase in George Yard Buildings on August 7, 1888, the body had been repeatedly pierced, probably with a bayonet. This woman had, with a fellow prostitute, been in company of 2 soldiers in the early part of the evening. These men were arrested, but the second prostitute failed or refused to identify, and the soldiers were accordingly discharged. 2. Alice Mackenzie was found with her throat cut, or rather stabbed, in Castle Alley on July 17, 1889. No evidence was forthcoming and no arrests were made in connection with this case. The stab in the throat was of the same nature as in the case of the murder. 3. Francis Coles in Swallow Gardens, on February 13, 1891, for which Thomas Sadler, a fireman, was arrested, and, after several remands, discharged. It was ascertained at the time that Sadler had sailed for the Baltic on July 19, 89, and was in Whitechapel on the night of 17th idem. He was a man of ungovernable temper and entirely addicted to drink and the company of the lowest prostitutes. 4. The case of the unidentified woman whose trunk was found in Pynchon St. on 10 September 1889, which has already been dealt with. M. L. Macnaghten, February 23, 1894. Bibliography: 100 Years of Riperature by Alexander Kelly. What has made the Ripper case so attractive to generations of crime writers? And why do so many readers, film buffs, and television watchers find these crimes irresistible? There are some obvious reasons for our continuing fascination with these murders. Sex crimes always seem to attract special attention. Ask any journalist. The murderer appeared and disappeared at will in almost supernatural manner, and the drama was acted out in an alien and mysterious underworld of poverty and refugees, prostitution and squalor, a world normally hidden behind a curtain of Victorian middle-class respectability. In the end, what makes the Ripper different, though, is that he was never caught. Crime coverage in the Victorian period and in our own day usually follows a pattern. First we have the discovery of horrible murder, then a sensational hunt and arrest, and finally we are told more than we could wish to know during, or after, the trial. In the Ripper case there was a, not very fully reported, hunt and there were arrests, but of course there was no trial, at least at the time. Instead, each of the main books on the case sets out an elaborate statement for the prosecution of their chosen villain, but with no convincing defense offered. If a defense counsel had been able to get to work on the matter's theory, for instance, one challenge of call your South American witness or sit down, would have been enough to see the case out of court. Only once, when the Duke of Clarence was put in the dock and then swiftly exonerated, with the aid of the court diary published in the Times, Has anything like a forensic debate taken place when a new theory emerged? What usually happens is that the case for the defense is put much later, in the next book on the subject. 340 For this reason a number of more or less daft ideas have been given time to take hold. For the same reason, most books on the case start off well with a thorough demolition job on the latest theory or crop of theories before descending into an Alice in Wonderland presentation of the prosecution case against somebody else. The result has been an irresistible potpourri of charges, countercharges, and dispute, so much so that some of the recent books have not bothered to add to the list of candidates. Only a sensible solution could ruin the Ripper case. Fortunately, the combined effects of passing years, an absence of key facts and endlessly fertile inventing make a solution increasingly unlikely. How about Queen Victoria as the next candidate with Sir William Gull as her accomplice? Speculation about the identity of the Ripper began almost as soon as it became clear that these were not isolated murders. The daily and Sunday newspapers were soon competing furiously to be first with details of the next murder and to give the most gory evidence from each inquest. In the absence of any real news from the police about their murder hunt, the press started one of their own and packed their columns with fresh suspects. The Daily News excelled at this, pointing the finger at everyone from Texans to policemen, or new ways of catching him. This was the forte of the Pall Mall Gazette, which offered bloodhounds, women detectives, and prize fighters dressed as women, amongst many suggestions. If one Gazette idea had been adopted, Jack's work would have been made much easier. This was for everyone to report to the police before going to bed, presumably so that they could be killed on the way home. The first signs of the Ripper industry were now showing in Britain and the USA with the pamphlets by Brewer and Fox. A number of broadsheets were also issued to celebrate the latest atrocity. Not to be outdone, all sorts of contemporary magazines and journals, from the British Medical Journal to Fun, Moonshine, and Punch, pitched in with comments or specialist advice. For a survey of all these publications, see the facts and the theories which follows. Dr. Arthur MacDonald, an early American criminologist, can probably be claimed as the first writer to try to find a serious explanation for the murders, although he got no further than giving pathological sexual passion as the cause in his Criminology, 1893. His French contemporary, Professor Jean Lacassagne, went one better when reprinting MacDonald's account in his own book on Joseph Bocker, known as The Disemboweler, by including police photographs of the corpses of 2 Ripper victims. When William L. E. Keir came to write his collection of tall stories and reminiscences, Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks, 1923, he drew upon his early experience covering the murders for the Globe and putting together an unlikely case against a Dr. Padashenko. From here on the theories begin to flow thick and fast. Of the key publications, the first classic book on the case was The Mystery of Jack the Ripper, 1929, by Leonard Matters. This is a classic only in the sense that it was the first book devoted entirely to the Ripper. The theory put forward is best regarded as pure fiction, with the idea of Dr. Stanley avenging his son's death probably being inspired by a retelling of the discovery of the guilty doctor by clairvoyant Robert Lee's story, which had been current since at latest 1895, when a version had apparently appeared in the People. William Stewart's Jack the Ripper, A New Theory, 1939, is a feeble book which argues improbably that Jack was a woman. Much better written but shored up with a recycled version of the Padashenko notion is The Identity of Jack the Ripper, 1959 and 1970, by Donald McCormick. Apart from Stewart, who described himself as an artist, the early writers from L. E. Kerr onwards were all journalists, and their books have the flavor of the news cuttings file and of saloon bar chats with dubious witnesses rather than of rigorous research. Robin Odell's Jack the Ripper in Fact and Fiction, 1965, changed all that. His suggestion of the Ripper as a Shachath, or Jewish ritual slaughterman, was 342 not strongly supported, but there was no doubt about the painstaking effort that went into establishing the facts of the case and reviewing the theories. Publication of this book by Harrap also led to the fruitful association with that publisher's expert on crime, Gogh, the results of which can be seen listed below and in the present book. Following Odell's breakthrough came the first serious candidate for the Ripper mantle. Television broadcaster and writer Dan Farson had been pursuing Montague Druitt for some time when an American crime writer, Tom Cullen, became interested in the same person. Cullen's book Autumn of Terror, 1965, at last offered a plausible suspect even if neither Cullen nor Farson in his Jack the Ripper, 1972, were able to prove that Druitt had ever been to Whitechapel. Both Cullen's and Farson's books are still worth seeking out, although they have been overtaken by several new theories. Dr. Thomas Stowley never actually identified his suspect in print, but he told enough people to ensure that the S referred to in his criminologist article, published in 1970, was soon identified as the Duke of Clarence. Soon afterwards the historian Michael Harrison challenged this attribution in Clarence, 1972, and turned the spotlight on J.K. Stephen instead. As a dilettante poet and misogynist, Stephen had some promising attributes for a Ripper, but seekers after this book should be warned that it is a worthy biography of a minor and not very interesting duke. The golden age of Ripper theories was now well advanced, and two more offerings came almost at once, this time on television. In the BBC series Jack the Ripper 1973, fictional detectives Barlow and Watt proposed either a conspiracy by high-ranking Freemasons or a bizarre scheme involving the royal doctor and a coachman beating off the Catholic threat to the throne. Sanity was restored for the moment by Donald Rumbelow's The Complete Jack the Ripper, 1975. This book, by a City of London policeman, was easily the best guide to the crimes and the theories published before the present book. One word of warning is necessary, though. You should try to get hold of the hardback version. The paperback edition, published in 1976, lacks both Colin Wilson's lively introduction and an index, A Small Crime in Itself. Although the flow of Ripper books continued for 3 more years, on the whole they were disappointing fare. Stephen Knight's Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, returned to the royal doctor and coachman, adding painter Walter Sickert and a surreal but amusing plot that transforms conspiracy theory into a new art form. The books by Whittington Egan, 1976, and Douglas, 1979, add no new theories and little by way of fact, and Spearing's book is not recommended. Ripper fans can look forward to a treat in the next year or two as the centenary publications appear, but, unless Jack decides to put in a reappearance, there must be a limit to the possible variations on a good yarn. The next 100 years will tell. Turning for a moment to the Ripper stories that do not pretend to be true, The Lodger, 1911, by M.R.S. Belloc-Lowndes deserves special mention as one of the most popular and successful variations on the theme, alongside Colin Wilson's Ritual in the Dark, 1960. An honorable mention is also earned by Robert Bloch, who persistently returned to the subject. Two of his finest offerings are the short story Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, 1945, and his most recent Sally the Night of the Ripper, 1984, which is a clever blend of fact and fiction. The Ruling Class, 1968, a powerful play by Peter Barnes which later became one of Peter O'Toole's best films, is the other outstanding work, ahead of a field that includes an episode of the TV program Star Trek, various American TV police dramas, and stories offering almost all of the main Sherlock Holmes characters as the Ripper, including Dr. Watson and the Maestro himself. 344 The Facts and the Theories. Aberconway, Lady Christabel. Letter in New Statesman, London, on November 7, 1959. Lady Aberconway, Macnaghten's daughter, claimed to possess my father's notes on Jack the Ripper, naming 3 suspects. Adam, Hargrave Lee, editor, Trial of George Chapman 223 p. Hodge, London, 1930. In Notable British Trials series. Dismisses the unsupported testimony of Macnaghten, Anderson, and Sir Henry Smith, who claimed to know the Ripper's identity. tabulates the case for supposing that Chapman was the Ripper. Adam, Hargrave Lee George Chapman in the Black Maria or the Criminals Omnibus, edited by Harry Hodge, Gollancz, London, 1935. Reiterates his earlier material. Alexander, Mark Royal Murder 221 P. Muller, London, 1978. Includes a chapter by Colin Wilson on the Ripper outlining the events and the Clarence, Stephen, and Gull/Netley theories. Ambler, Eric, The Ability to Kill and Other Pieces 191 P. Bodley Head, London, 1963. Includes 9 pages outlining the crimes and the suggestion that having achieved an apotheosis of horror, he had at last exorcised the evil that had haunted him. Anderson, Robert, Criminals and Crime, Some Facts and Sug. Gestions 182 P. Nisbet, London, 1907. The then head of the Criminal Investigation Department makes a passing reference to the Ripper being safely caged in an asylum. Anderson, Robert, The Lighter Side of My Official Life 295 P. Hodder, London, 1910. The Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew, but no evidence is offered. Anderson, Robert, The Lighter Side of My Official Life. 11 at Scotland Yard in Blackwood's Magazine, Edinburgh, March 1910. Pages 357-8 give a similar account to that in his book of the same title, but a footnote adds that a witness identified the Ripper who was caged in an asylum, but when he learned that the suspect was a fellow Jew he declined to swear to him. Anderson, Robert, in his preface to the Police Encyclopedia Vol. 1 by Hargrave Lee Adam, 237 P. Routledge, London, 1911. Anderson claimed that there was no doubt as to the identity of the criminal. Archer, Fred, Ghost Detectives, Crime and the Psychic World 176 P. W. H. Allen, London, 1970. Retells the story of clairvoyant Lees. See Daily Express. Athol, Justin, who was Jack the Ripper, in Reynolds News, London, of September 15, 1946. He was an epileptic medical student. Barker, Richard H., editor, The Fatal Caress and Other Accounts of English Murders from 1551 to 1891 210 P. Duell, Sloan, and Pearce, New York, 1947. Pages 164-09 carry the Times reports of 1888. Barnard, Alan, editor, The Harlot Killer, The Story of Jack the Ripper in Fact and Fiction 248 p. Dodd Mead, New York, 1953. Anthology of more or less relevant pieces. Barnett, Henrietta Octavia Weston Cannon Barnett, His Life, Works and Friends by his wife, 2 vols. Murray, London, 1918. Second volume has a chapter on Whitechapel conditions when he went there as vicar, including reactions to the Ripper outrages. Baverstock, Keith, Footsteps Through London's Past, A Discovering 3 Guide 56 p. Shire Pubs. London, 1972. The Ripper Walks are on pages 4-10. Beattie, John, The Yorkshire Ripper Story 160 p. Quartet, London, 1981. This account of the recent spate of murders concludes with 2 pages on the East End crimes. Beaumont, F.A. The Fiend of East London, Jack the Ripper, pages 243-53 of the 50 most amazing crimes of the last 100 years 768 p. Odhams, London, 1936. Describes 6 murders, then tails off into the matters theory. Bell, Donald, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, in The Criminologist Vol. 9 No. 33, Summer 1974, pages 40-61. Conjectures that Dr. Thomas Neil Cream bought 346 himself out of an American prison and performed the Ripper murders. Bell, Quinton Virginia Woolf, A Biography, Volume 1. Virginia Stephen 1882-1912 230 p. Hogarth Press, London, 1972. Details of the Madness of Cousin James Kenneth Stephen, pages 35-6. Vermont, Heim Point of Arrival, A Study of London's East End 292 p. Methuen, London, 1975. Chapter 9 discusses the suggestion that the killer was a Jew. Binney, Cecil Crime and Abnormality 176 p. Oxford UP, Oxford, 1949. Relays an account of the Ripper as a religious maniac who conducted open-air services on Margate Beach. Bloch, Yvonne's Sexual Life in England Past and Present 664 p. Alder, London, 1938. Said to have been identified as an insane student. Blundell, Nigel The World's Greatest Mysteries 224 p. Octopus, London, 1980. A good 6-page summary of the main theories. Bohr, Roger, and Blundell, Nigel The World's Most Infamous Murders 192 p. Octopus, London, 1983. Pages 92-7 offer the Druid theory and some illustrated police news pictures. Bokak, John Paul article in the New York World, 1888, ascribed the murders to Nicholas Vasily, a Russian member of the Shorn sect, according to R.K. Fox. Borchard, Edwin Montefiore convicting the innocent, Errors of Criminal Justice with the collaboration of E. Russell Lutz 421 p. Yale Institute of Human Relations, Connecticut, 1932. Chapter on Frenchy, Amir Ben Ali which links the Algerian with the Ripper. Brewer, John Francis The Curse upon Mitre Square AD 1530188872 p. Simpkin, Marshall, London, 1888. The Return of Brother Martin after 3.5 centuries to wreak more vengeance upon womankind. British Journal of Photography, London, October 19, 1888 pp. 659-60 critical of police for failure to use photography at scenes of crime and suggests divisional. Photographers. Comments on facsimile posters relating to the case. Its November 16, 1888 issue p. 723 records use of photographs at Kelly murder, reiterates suggestion for divisional photographers. Brooks, John Alfred Rowland Murder in Fact and Fiction 284 p. Hurst and Blackett, London, 1925. Mentions McNaughton's suspects and concludes that the murders were probably the work of a doctor or medical student, pp. 116-17, Brown, Douglas G. The Rise of Scotland Yard, A History of the Metropolitan Police 392 p. Harrap, London, 1956. Lists the pertinent facts. Buckle, George Earle, editor, The Letters of Queen Victoria, 3rd series. A selection from Her Majesty's correspondence and journal between the years 1886 and 1901. Volume 1 18861890 p. Murray, London, 1930. Page 447 has the text of a cipher telegram to Lord Salisbury instructing these courts must be lit, and our detectives improved. Page 449 carries a draft letter listing some of the questions that occur to the Queen. Butler, Arthur Was Jack the Ripper a Woman? In the Sun, London, August 29 to September 1, 1972. A former chief superintendent introduces a variation on St. Wart's theory involving a female abortionist and male accomplice. Butler, Yvonne Murderers London 238 p. Hale, London, 1973. The opening chapter tours the Ripper streets. Factually sound. Camps, Francis E. More about Jack the Ripper in London Hospital Gazette April 1966, reprinted in The Criminologist, London, February 1968 and in Camps on Crime 181 p. David and Charles, Newton Abbott, 1973. Includes a plan and pencil sketches of a victim. Camps, Francis E. and Barber, Richard The Investigation of Murder 143 p. Michael Joseph, London, 1966. The professor of forensic medicine at London University devotes his opening chapter to the Ripper, considered from the viewpoint of detection methods used. Con 3480 eludes that the murderer may not have been caught even using modern methods. Cargill, David, and Holland, Julian Scenes of Murder, A London Guide 230p. Heinemann, London, 1964. Records the locations of the murders. Chambers Guide to London, The Secret City 160p. Ocean Books, London, 1974. The author has 4 pages on the Ripper, concludes that he was a female abortionist and claims the theory as his own. Chester, Lewis, Leach, David, and Simpson, Colin. The Cleveland Street Affair 236p. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1976. Found no evidence for the Duke of Clarence as the Ripper. Chicago Sunday Times Herald, April 28, 1895. Knight quotes an article entitled Capture of Jack the Ripper, in which Dr. Howard discloses that the Ripper was another doctor who was declared insane and incarcerated. Includes the earliest known version of the Lees theory. Clark Kennedy, Archibald Edmund. The London, A Study of the Voluntary Hospital System, Volume 2. The Second Hundred Years 1840 to 1948, 310p. Pittman, London, 1963. Covers the usual ground. Cobb, Geoffrey Belton. Critical Years at the Yard, The Career of Frederick Williamson of the Detective Department and the CID, 251p. Faber, London, 1956. Recounts top-level police reaction to the murders. Critical of Anderson, Williamson took no part. County of Middlesex Independent 2 and January 5, 1889, reported the death of suspect Druitt. Crowley, Alistair. The Confessions of Alistair Crowley, an autobiography, abridged edition by John Simons and Kenneth Grant, 1058p. Cape, London, 1969, Hill and Wang, New York, 1970. Originally 6 volumes, of which 2 were published as The Spirit of Solitude in 1929. Page 755 records the view that the Ripper committed 7 murders to obtain supreme black magic power by forming a cavalry cross of 7 points. After the 3rd killing he achieved invisibility. Cullen, Tom A. Autumn of Terror, Jack the Ripper, His Crimes and Times, 254p. Bodley Head, London, 1965, illustrated. American edition published as When London Walked in Terror. Houghton, Boston, 1965. The 1966 British paperback edition was reprinted as The Crimes and Times of Jack the Ripper in 1973. A painstaking book which considers various theories and identifies for the first time the 3 prime suspects. As Montague Druitt, a barrister, as the killer. Daily Dispatch, Manchester, April 10, 1905. p5. Jack the Ripper, A Startling Confession in New York. Charles Y. Herman takes a bow, but police believe that the man is suffering from hallucinations. Daily Express, London, How I Caught Jack the Ripper. March 7, 1931. p. 7, Clairvoyant Who Tracked Jack the Ripper. March 9, 1931, p3, Jack the Ripper's End. March 10, 1931. p3. 3 articles tell how Robert James Lees tracks down the killer, a prosperous West End doctor who was certified insane by a commission de lunatico inquirendo after his 17th murder. Daily News, London, the issues for 1888 carry a continuous commentary on the murders and inquests. Theories propounded feature the Ripper in women's clothes, as a Texan or fanatical vivisectionist, as a policeman, and using the sewers as an escape route. Daily Telegraph, London, Contemporary Issues. That for October 4, 1888 carried a facsimile of a Ripper letter and postcard. Also advocated police right to stop and search people for knives. Davis, Derek. Jack the Ripper, The Handwriting Analysis in the Criminologist, Vol. 9, No. 33, Summer 1974, pages 62 to 9. Examines two Ripper letters and asserts that both were written by poisoner Dr. Cream. Deacon, Richard the Cambridge Apostles, A History of Cambridge University's Elite Intellectual Secret Society 214 P. Robert Royce, London, 1985. Inconclusive discussion of whether J.K. Stephen was the Ripper. Deacon, Richard A History of the British Secret Service 440 p. 350 Muller, London, 1969. Pages 29 to 30 recount the L.E. Kerr story. Deacon is a pseudonym of Donald McCormick. Deacon, Richard A History of the Russian Secret Service 568 p. Muller, London, 1972. Donald McCormick has another go at his theory. Dearden, Harold, who was Jack the Ripper, in Great Unsolved Crimes by A.J. Allen and others, 351 p. Hutchinson, London, 1935. Attributes the murders to some doctor or medical student. Do, Walter I. Caught Crippen 242 p. Blackie, London, 1938. Devotes a third of the book to the Ripper, describes events with plenty of local color because he was stationed with the CID in Whitechapel. No theory. Dictionary of National Biography Smith, Elder, London, 1898. Entries for J.F. Stephen and his son. Douglas, Arthur Will the Real Jack the Ripper 72 p. Countryside Pubs. Chorley, Lanks. 1979 Illustrated. His account of the murders concentrates on the discrepancies in other commentaries. Decides that the Ripper was a mere nobody after all. Douthwaite, Louis Charles Mass Murder 288 p. Long, London, 1928. Disposes of the Deeming Ripper assertion by claiming that at the time of the murders Deeming was in prison. East, John M. Neath the Mask, The Story of the East Family 356 p. Allen and Unwin, London, 1967. Refers to an encounter between a stall attendant and a suspect. Easler, Robert Mann into Wolf, An Anthropological Interpretation of Sadism, Masochism, and Lycanthropy. 286 p. Routledge, London, 1951. Makes a passing reference in support of the possibility that the Ripper was a woman. Empire News, Manchester, October 28, 1923 pp. 1-2 A New Story of Jack the Ripper. An Empire News student of criminology asserted that every head of police knows that Jack the Ripper died in Morris Plains lunatic asylum in 1902. The Ripper was Mr. Fogelma, a Norwegian sailor. Evening News, London, March 5, 1954 p6 Obituary of Chief Inspector James Stockley notes that he was disguised as a loafer, costermonger, milkman, chimney sweep, and itinerant musician as part of Ripper operation. Farson, Daniel the Hamlin Book of Horror 157 p. Hamlin, London, 1977. 8 pages of illustrated text on the Ripper. Farson, Daniel Jack the Ripper 144 p. Joseph, London, 1972. Arrives at the same conclusion as Cullen, but by a somewhat different route. More evidence is offered against M.J. Druitt. The first recent book to include photographs of the corpses of Eddowes and Kelly, 2 of these appeared in Le Cassagne. The paperback edition, Sphere, London, 1973, carries additional information. Farson, Daniel The Truth, The Whole Truth in the London Evening News for 1822 September 1972. 5 articles on the murders based on his book. Nothing new until Part 4 in which Montague Druitt is identified. Fee Jean Bam, Benjamin article in Arbiter Freund, London, December 21, 1888 denies a Church Times claim that Jack was a Russian anarchist. Fishman, William J. East End Jewish Radicals 1875-1914 336 p. Duckworth, London, 1975. Passing references to the Ripper and to the suggestion that he was a Russian anarchist. Fishman, William J. The Streets of East London 139 P. Duckworth, London, 1979. 4 illustrated pages. Forbes, Archibald. The Motive of the Murders. Letter to the Daily News published on October 3, 1888 p. 6 labels the killer as a monomaniac seeking revenge against the class a member of which has wrought him his blighting hurt. Perhaps an excitable medical student. Ford Madox returned to yesterday 438 p. Gollancz, London, 1931. Claims that his nurse, Mrs. Atterbury, discovered the body of one of the victims and saw a man vanish into the fog. What fog? Fox, Richard Kyle. The History of the Whitechapel Murders, a 352b full and authentic narrative of the above murders with sketches. W. 48 p. Fox, New York, 1888. The editor of the National Police Gazette rehashes news reports of 9 murders potty mded out by a paraphrase of De Quincey's version of the B. Ratcliffe Highway murders. Attributes crimes to Nicholas B. Vaslav. B. Franklin, Charles. The World's Worst Murderers, exciting and authentic accounts of the great classics of murder. 320 p. Iodhams, London, 1965. Pages 13 to 23 sketch in the events and the theories then current. Suggests that the Ripper may have retired after the Kelly killing. Friedland, Martin L. The Trials of Israel Lipsky 219 p. Macmillan, London, 1984. Suggests that the anti-Semitic press response to the murders may have been orchestrated to curtail Jewish immigration. Gott, Joseph H. and Odell, Robin. Murder What Junet, an illustrated account of the methods of murder. 247 p. Harrap, London, 1982. Jack is the only murderer to receive an entry under his own name. Gott, Joseph H. and Odell, Robin. Murder Whereabouts. 286 p. Harrap, London, 1986. Only passing references to Whitechapel's favorite son/daughter. Gott, Joseph H. and Odell, Robin. The murderers whose outstanding international cases from the literature of J. Murder in the last 150 years. 269 p. Harrap, London, 1979. Includes 2 pages on the crimes and favorite suspects and a passing reference to the subject by Colin Wilson in his introduction. J. F. George, Earl Lloyd George. 248 p. Muller, London, R. 1960. Similar account to that by Owen, below. /Ghastly Murder in the East End 1888. Broadsheet reproduced J. in Cullen. Goodman, Jonathan. Bloody Versicles, The Rhymes of Crime. 224 p. David and Charles, Newton Abbott, UK, 1971. 3 pages on the Ripper ditties. Green, Jonathan. The Directory of Infamy, The Best of the Worst. 288 p. Mills and Boon, London, 1980. A small entry on the master. Gribble, Leonard Reginald. The Man They Thought Was Jack the Ripper in True Detective, London, March 1977. Pages 412, 49. George Chapman examined and dismissed. Gribble, Leonard Reginald was Jack the Ripper, a black magician, in True Detective, London, January 1973. pp. 16 to 25. An illustrated and inaccurate account explores this idea. Griffiths, Arthur George Frederick. Mysteries of Police and Crime. Vol. 1 464 p. Castle, London, 1898. Records 3 suspects: a Polish Jew, a Russian doctor and a doctor who was later found drowned. Haynes, Max. Crime Flashback, Book 2 230 p. Toronto Sun, Canada, 1981. 8 pages on the Ripper. Supports Druitt. Halstead, Dennis Gradwick. Doctor in the 90s. 206 p. Johnson, London, 1959. Halstead was at the London hospital at the time and described the atmosphere and general suspicion which fell on medical men. Outlines 6 murders and suggests that Jack was a syphilitic sailor of the North Sea fishing fleet. Hansard's Parliamentary Debates, Commons. The record of what is said in the lower house of Parliament. An index is available for the period. Harris, Melvin. The Murders and the Medium in the Unexplained, Mysteries of Mind, Space, and Time. 65, 1981, 1290-3. Illustrated article. In this part work looks at and dismisses the Lees legend. Harrison, Fraser. The Dark Angel, Aspects of Victorian Sexuality. 288 P. Sheldon Press, London, 1977. Jack rates only 2 pages but is credited with 8 murders. Harrison, Michael. Clarence, The Life of the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, kg 1864-1892. 253 p. W. H. Allen, London, 1972. Reattributes Stowell's Clarence theory to J. K. Stephen. Hayne, W. J. Jack the Ripper, or the Crimes of London. 1889. Stolen from the Library of Congress and untraced elsewhere. 354 Hurd, Richard. The Secret of Ex-Convict. SY 545 in the London Evening News. September 8, 1955. Old Lag's Tale of His Wife as Jill the Ripper. Hibbert, Christopher. The Roots of Evil, A Social History of Crime and Punishment. 524 P. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1963. Passing Account of Events. Hill, William Boyle. A New Earth and a New Heaven. 312 p. Watts, London, 1936. Pages 1-1927 of the Spiritualist book recount the Lees story as reported by the Daily Express. Honeycomb, Gordon. The Murders of the Black Museum. 1870-1970. 296 p. Hutchinson, London, 1982. Pages 5-14 outline the events and regurgitate some of the usual illustrations. He favors Druitt. Howard, Philip. We Thundered Out, 200 Years of the Time. 1785-1985. 176 p. Times Books, London, 1985. 2 pages of reports, and pictures, from the Illustrated Police News and from the Times of November 10, 1888. Hubler, Richard Gibson. A Stunning Explanation of the Jack the Ripper Riddle in Coronet, New York, November 1956. pp. 100-6. Hyde, H. Montgomery Carson, The Life of Sir Edward Carson, Lord Carson of Duncombe. 515 p. Heinemann, London, 1953. Pages 182-3. Link. George Chapman with the Ripper. Int. Allen. Article in True Magazine, New York, 1956. Has Griffith S. Salway discovering a Spanish Ripper's identity via a trunk with a false bottom. Hint. Allen. Murder Unlimited in Good Housekeeping, New York, February 1945. pp. 29, 197-200. Describes contacts between Matthew Parker, a fruiterer, and the Ripper in otherwise orthodox account. Illustrated Police News. Law Courts and Weekly Record, London. The issue for August 18, 1888 carried a report and illustration of tragedy in Whitechapel. A woman stabbed in 13 places, then from September 8 to December 8 inclusive. The sensation sheet kept the murders on the boil with a weekly report, always on page 2, and a total of 184. Cover pictures of uniformly crude appearance. Sporadic coverage to 1892. The issues for 8 and September 22, 6 and October 20, and November 17, 1888 were reproduced in great newspapers. Reprinted February 25, 1974. Published by Peter Way Ltd., London. Inglis, Norman. Was Jack the Ripper Caught? In Titbits, London, May 12, 1962. A Sighting. Jack the Ripper, The Story of the Whitechapel Murders in Famous Crimes Past and Present, London, 1903. Vol. 2 No. 15 pages 25-30, No. 16 pages 49-58, No. 17 pages 73-81. Number 18, pages 97-102. Published by Harold Furness. Jack is a lunatic suffering from erotomania. He was a doctor, not Neil Cream, was mad, and is now probably dead. Jack the Ripper at work again. Another terrible murder and mutilation in Whitechapel 4p. No publisher given, November 9, 1888. Broadsheet with pictures of the supposed murderer and the victim, 2 columns of news and 4 of doggerel. Jackson, Robert Francis Camps, Famous Case Histories of the Celebrated Pathologist 208p. Hart Davis, London, 1975. Chapter 9. Camps on the Ripper outlines the events of the time and claims that Camps came down in favor of the Farson theory. Janino, E.A. Jack the Ripper. Paper presented to a discussion session at the Third International Meeting on Forensic Pathology, London 1963. Postulated moon madness theory for Boston and Whitechapel murders. Jones, Elwyn, and Lloyd, John the Ripper File 204p. Futura Barker, London, 1975. The Book of the Television Series. Ignore the Barlow and Watt linking passages, and this represents one of the best collections of factual readings on the case, complete with the Freemason conspiracy and Sickert theories. Keating, P.J. Fact and Fiction in the East End in the Victorian City, Images and Realities, Volume 2, edited by H.J. Dias and Michael Woolf, Routledge, London, 1973. Suggests, pages 594-5, that the murders reinforced in 356 our image of the East End as violent and outcast rather than monotonous and outcast. Kelly, Alexander Garfield. Jack the Ripper, A Bibliography and Review of the Literature 55p. Association of Assistant Librarians, SED, London, 1973, 2nd edition 88p 1984. Includes an introduction to the murders and the theories by Colin Wilson. Kingston, Charles. The Bench and the Dock 290p. Stanley Paul, London, 1925, pages 203-4 describe James Monday Rowe's supposed involvement in the Ripper search. Reports the suspects as a West End doctor and a medical student at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Knight, Stephen. Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution 284p. Harrap, London, 1976. Illustrated. Painter Walter Sickert, Sir William Gull and John Netley go to endless trouble to eliminate 4 prostitutes who were party to royal blackmail. A paperback edition by Treasure, London, in 1984. Knight, Stephen. Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution in the Evening News, London, June 21, pages 15-17, 22nd, pp. 12-13, 23rd, pages 10-11, 24th, 12-13, 25th, 16-17, L 976. Adapted from the book by Arthur Pottersman and Simon Broadbeck. Knight, Stephen. The Brotherhood, The Secret World of the Freemasons 336p. Granada, London, 1984. 4-page reiteration of bits of his earlier book. Knight, Stephen. Why Sickert denied Ripper tale in the Sunday Times, London, July 2, 1978. His reply to David May, QV. Lacassagne, Jean Alexander Eugene Vacher Elie Ventreur et les Crimes City Case 314p. Stork, Lyons, Masson, Paris, 1899. Pages 254-65. Carey MacDonald's account for comparison with the crimes of Joseph Vacher. Notable for photographs of the Kelly and Eddowes corpses. Lamb, David C. On Active Service for Humanity, He Found His Soul on Devil's Island in Titbits, London, 23 September Ember 1939 pp. 6-7. The Memoirs of the Salvation Army Commissioner recall a sign writer visitor who had dieted the death of Carity Nell. Lamb adds, remembering my visitor's exceptional dexterity, his story of seeing visions of blood, his strange demeanor and his remarkable forecast, I have now little doubt in my mind that he was Jack the Ripper. Lancet, London, this medical journal challenged the view that the Ripper was a lunatic, September 15, 1888, and carried a letter from Dr. Henry Sutherland on 22 September which diagnosed that he or they are of perfectly sound mind. It commented on Coroner's Court Evidence, September 29, and urged sanitary reform in Whitechapel, October 6. Leicester, William. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks 320 p. Nash and Grayson, London, 1923. Covered the events for the Globe. Quotes from Rasputin's own manuscript which revealed the Ripper as Dr. Alexander Padashenko. Leeson, Benjamin. Lost London, The Memoirs of an East End Detective 187 p. S. Paul, London, 1934. Tells how he was called to the scene of the Coles murder, the rest is hearsay. Claims 13 victims and hints at a certain doctor, known to me. Linklater, Magnus. Did Jack the Ripper have royal blood? In the Sunday Times, London, November 1, 1970. Elaborates on the Stowell theory naming Edward, Duke of Clarence as the suspect. Lithner, Klaas vem var Jack Uppskararen? Who was Jack the Ripper? In Jury, Stockholm, No. 2 1973 pages 12 to 16. Surveys the case and theories. Logan, Guy B.H. Masters of Crime, Studies of Multiple Murders 288 p. Paul, London, 1928. Chapter on the Ripper concludes that he was a victim of syphilis from America who had declared war on the special class from which he chose his victims. Lowndes, Susan, editor, Diaries and Letters of Marie Belloc. Lowndes 1911-1947 291 p. Chatto and Windus, London, 1971. Pages 96-8 describe origins of the lodger and record Hemingway's enthusiasm for the book. 358 Lustgarten, Edgar. The Illustrated Story of Crime 223 p. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1976. Pages 208-13 give a brief resume of the case, with pictures. McCormick, George, Donald, King, The Identity of Jack the Ripper 192 p. Jarolds, London, 1959, 2nd edition 256 p. Long, London, 1970. Illustrated. Detailed account of the murders and leading suspects. Postulates Dr. Alexander Padashenko as a Tsarist secret agent who committed the murders to discredit London anarchists. Colin Wilson commented that he accepts the evidence of Leicester, a pathological liar, but this claim is refuted in the 2nd edition. MacDonald, Arthur Le Criminal Type dans quelques forums graves de la criminalité Stork, Lyons, 1893. Includes an account of 11 Ripper murders between 1887 and 1889. MacDonald, Arthur. Criminology 416 p. Funk and Wagnalls, New York, 1893. The pioneering American criminologist found that the atrocities are without doubt caused by a pathological sexual passion. McGowan, Bill. Who was Jack the Ripper? In the London Evening News, September 1, 1964 p. 7. Various conjectures including the Ripper as a woman, policeman, mad surgeon, American sailor. MacLeod, CMA. Ripper handwriting analysis in The Criminologist, London, August 1968 pp. 120-7. A Canadian graphologist analyzed 2 letters reproduced in the Camps article and concluded that they were written by different people, the first of whom may have been the Ripper. Macnaghten, Melville. L. Days of My Years 300 p. Arnold, London, 1915. Treacly Memoirs by a Chief of CID suggest that the boss letter came from a journalist and that the Ripper committed suicide. Marjoribanks, Edward. The Life of Lord Carson. Volume 1 455 p. Gollancz, London, 1932. The Life of the Great Advocate who prosecuted George Chapman the Poissonneur. Conjectures that Chapman was the Ripper, pages 304-5. Marjoribanks, Edward. The Life of Sir Edward Marshall /fa//483 P. Gollancz, London, 1929. Contains anecdotes about Neil Cream, who confessed to being the Ripper. Hall dismissed the idea, pp. 48-50, Marne, Patricia. Crime and Sex in Handwriting 150 P. Constable, London, 1981. Analysis of two possible Ripper letters. Marx, Roland. L'Enigme Jack Iventurier in El Histoire 62, December. 1983, pages 10-21. Detailed review of the facts, theories and fictional variations. Masters, Rel. and Lee, Edward. Sex Crimes in History, Evolving Concepts of Sadism, Lust, Murder, and Necrophilia from Ancient to Modern Times 323 p. Julian P., New York, 1963. Pages 81-8. Attribute 9, and possibly 20, murders which were not committed without a certain redeeming grace, a saving wit, a mitigating sophistication and savoir-faire. Matters, Leonard W. The Mystery of Jack the Ripper 254 P. Hutchinson, London, 1929. Illustrated. Variously reprinted since. The first classic work on the subject has a conjectural theory based on a confession relayed at second hand. The murderer is a doctor revenging his son. The 1948 reissue published by W. H. Allen has a new introductory chapter. Matters, Leonard W. Will we ever solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper, in the Sunday Express, London, May 4, 1930. Discusses the Chapman-Ripper proposition and refutes it because it is directly opposed to my own theory. May, Betty Tiger Woman, My Story 232 P. Duckworth, London, 1929. Written by Bernard O'Donnell, Origin Ally as a series of articles for the World's Pictorial News. Includes an incident in which Aleister Crowley claimed to have the ties of the Ripper, who was a surgeon-magician. May, David. Jack the Ripper solution was a hoax, man confesses in the Sunday Times, London, June 18, 1978. Joseph Sickert disowns the Stephen Knight story. 360 I. Moore Anderson, Arthur P. Sir Robert Anderson and Lady Agnes Anderson 173 P. Marshall, Morgan, and Scott, London, 1947. Records the notions that Jack was a Malay seaman on shore leave, that a vital clay pipe was destroyed and that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer identified the suspect without Hesse. Tashin but refused to give evidence. Moreland, Nigel. Jack the Ripper, A Final Word in the Criminologist, London, Autumn 1971 pages 48-9. A handwriting analysis by Prof. C. L. Wilson showed no justification whatsoever for identifying Jack the Ripper with the Duke of Clarence. Moylan, John. Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police 398 p. Putnam, London, 1929. The former receiver to the Metropolitan Police said that it is almost certain that he escaped by committing suicide. Muse Man, Karl Hvemvar. Jack the Ripper? 102 p. Herman Peterson, Copenhagen, 1908. He was a Luis Zamirdi, a Hungarian who perfected his art in Argentina and eventually in Austria. He committed suicide. Nash, J. Robert. Compendium of World Crime 452 p. Harrap, London, 1983. Originally published as Almanac of World Crime 433 p. Anchor/Doubleday, New York, 1981. Skimpy treatment of the case, 3 pages plus 5 passing references. Favors Cream. Neal, Arthur Fowler. 40 Years of Manhunting 288 p. Jarolds, London, 1932. Police Superintendent presents the strong theory that poisoner George Chapman was the Ripper. Neal, Charles, Editor, The World's Greatest Mysteries 50 p. Neal, Australia, c. 1936, pages 5-19. How Jack the Ripper Was Caught retells the clairvoyant Lee's story. News Tatter, Walter Lindesay in the foreword to Jack the Ripper in Fact and Fiction by Robin Odell. News Tatter dismissed various medical theories before suggesting that the Ripper may have been schizophrenic. New York Daily Graphic, October 4, 1888, p. 744. London's Ghastly Mystery. Records. Dr. J. G. Kiernan's view that the Ripper was a cannibal. New York World Telegraph and Sun, February 15, 1960. The Killer as Alonzo Maduro from South America. Newton, H. Chance, Crime and the Drama or Dark Deeds Dramatized, 284 p. S. Paul, London, 1927. Refers to brief performances of horrible dramatic depictions of certain of the unspeakable murders committed by Jack the Ripper. Nicholson, Michael, The Yorkshire Ripper, 197 p. Star. W. H. Allen, London, 1979. Has a 4-page account of the Whitechapel murders. Audie, S. Ingleby, Inquest, 255 p. London, 1941, pages 57 to 62. Describes 7 crimes and Audie's visit to the sites with Conan Doyle. Notes Arthur Diozzi's theory that the murders were part of a black magic ritual and the objects found at the scenes of crime formed magical pentacles. Odell, Robin, Ian, Jack the Ripper in Fact and Fiction, 275 p. Harrap, London, 1965. Illustrated. The first thorough book on the subject. Examines the major suggestions, quoting at length from some protagonists. Advances the argument that Jack was a Shacheth or Jewish slaughterman. A revised paperback edition was published by Mayflower in 1966. O'Donnell, Eliot, Confessions of a Ghost Hunter, 323 p. Thornton Butterworth, London, 1928. Tales of Whitechapel Hauntings by Elizabeth Stride and Mary Kelly. O'Donnell, Eliot, Great Thames Mysteries, 288 p. Selwyn and Blount, London, 1929. A chapter on the Ripper speculating about links between the murders and cases of dismemberment in 1887-8. O'Donnell, Eliot, Haunted Britain, 192 p. Ryder, London, 1948. Page 36 has accounts of ghostly events in Whitechapel, recorded in 1895. O'Neill, P. Parting Shots, Clarence the Ripper, in Life, New York, November 13, 1970 pp. 85-8. Speculation on the Duke of Clarence theory. Owen, Frank, Tempestuous Journey, Lloyd George, His Life and Times, 784 p. Hutchinson, London, 1954. Tells of Lloyd, 362. George S. Shock at seeing East End conditions on a jaunt to catch the killer. Paley, Bruce, A New Theory on the Jack the Ripper Murders in True Crime Monthly, April 1982, pages 3 to 13. Now it is the turn of Joseph Barnett, who is at least known to have met, and lived with, Mary Kelly. Pall Mall Gazette, an evening newspaper and review, London. Plethora of material includes details of murders and inquests and a host of suggestions, e.g. bloodhounds, beagles, women detectives, and pugilists in drag. Pictures the Ripper as a Malay, Russian, Frenchman or policeman. An index is available. Pearsall, Ronald, The Worm in the Bud, The World of Victorian Sexuality, 560 p. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1969. Pages 306-13 provide an account of the murders with a wealth of background material, some of it rather remote. Pearson, Edmund Leicester, More Studies in Murder, 232 p. Random House, New York, 1936. A chapter on the murders is reprinted in Barnard. Adds nothing except a delightful comment on the theory of matters. The deathbed confession bears about the same relation to the facts of criminology as the exploits of Peter Rabbit, to zoology. The People, London, May 19, 1895. A startling story. Relays the Lee's theory from the Chicago Sunday Times Herald, according to Whittington Egan. People's Journal, September 26, 1919. Rumbelow, Q.V., quotes an item about the retirement of a detective named Steve White who had seen and almost arrested the Ripper. Pimlet, John Alfred Ralph Toynbee Hall, 50 Years of Social Progress 1884 to 1934 315 P. Dent, London, 1935. Pages 81 to 2 describe the efforts of a vigilance association to apprehend the Ripper. Platnick, Kenneth B. Great Mysteries of History 224 P. David and Charles, Newton Abbott, 1972. The main themes appear on pages 58 to 73. Police Gazette, London, the issue for October 26, 1888 has a series of descriptions of the wanted man. Pulling, Christopher Mr. Punch and the Police Butterworths, London, 1964, pages 120 to 30 describe reactions to the murders in Punch and elsewhere. Reproduces anti-establishment cartoons from Fun, one of which demands the resignation of the Home Secretary. Remarks on friction between the city and Metropolitan Police. Riley, B.E. Jack the Ripper, The Mystery Solved, in City of London Police Magazine, February 1972. Dr. Merchant is condemned because of his home, Brixton, and date of death, 1888, although no evidence is offered that he had ever been to Whitechapel. Reville, Joan. Read all about it. The Horrible Horoscope of Jack the Ripper in Prediction, London, June 1973, pages 6 to 9. Yes, it could have been M.J. Druitt or the Crown Prince of Austria. Reynolds News and Sunday Citizen, London, February 8, 1959 p. 9. Blacksmith gives yard vital clue, Jack the Ripper was my cousin. The Ripper as Frank Edwards, cousin of a retired Worthing blacksmith. Richardson, Joseph Hall. From the City to Fleet Street, Some Journalistic Experiences 302 p. S. Paul, London, 1927. Decribs the case, quotes a letter from Anderson and a description of the Ripper in the Police Gazette, London. Robertson, Terence. Madman who murdered 9 women in Reynolds News and Sunday Citizen, October 29, 1950 p. 3. Journalistic rehash of the 9 murders committed by a Polish sailor. Robinson, Tom. The Whitechapel Horrors, being an authentic account of the Jack the Ripper murders, 32 p. 80 Bank Pub, Manchester, no date. Attributes 7 murders to the killer. Rosenwater, Irving. Jack the Ripper, sort of a cricket person, in The Cricketer, January 1973 pp. 6 to 7, 22. Information about M.J. Druitt's cricketing career. The title refers to that of E.W. Swanton's autobiography. Rumbelow, Donald. The City of London Police Museum and Exhibition in Police Journal, Chichester, July 1970 pp. 343 to 4 reports that Metropolitan Police were 364 bidden to disturb Kelly corpse before the arrival of bloodhounds. Meanwhile, City Police entered the premises and took photographs. 4 photographs of the body of Eddowes are in the museum. Rumbelow, Donald. The Complete Jack the Ripper, 286 Pwh. Allen, London, 1975. Illustrated. The best book yet. Offers no new theory, but Colin Wilson's introduction adds artist Frank Miles to the role of Dishonor. The paperback edition, Star, 1976, lacks both introduction and index. A new edition is expected soon. Sabanclair, James. Jack the Ripper in the Trusty Servant, number 34, December 1972, pages 3-5. The Old Wickamist magazine celebrates one of its distinguished old Bobs, M.J. Druitt. Saxon, Peter. The Man Who Dreamed of Murder in Sexton Blake Library, November 3, 1958. Medium. Lee's Rides Again. Scott, Harold, editor, The Concise Encyclopedia of Crime and Criminals, Deutsch, London, 1961. Ripper article appears to have been written by McCormick. Shaw, George Bernard. Blood Money for Whitechapel, a leading article putting the socialist viewpoint in the Star of September 24, 1888. Shaw also wrote an unpublished letter to the Star as from J.C., abhorring capital punishment and repudiating attempts to catch the murderer. See his collected letters 1874-1897, p. 197, Reinhardt, London, 1965. Shue, Edward Spencer, A Companion to Murder 303, p. Cassell, London, 1960, Knopf, New York, 1962. Repeats the evidence of Adam that Chapman may have been the Ripper. Sims, George Robert, The Mysteries of Modem, London, 192, p. Pearson, London, 1906. Passing references to the Ripper, A Man of Birth and Education. Sitwell, Osbert, editor, of Free House, or The Artist as Craftsman, being the writings of Walter Richard Sickert, 362, p. Macmillan, London, 1947. Preface has the same story as recorded in Noble Essences. Sitwell, Osbert, Noble Essences of Courteous Revelations, being a book of characters and the fifth and last volume of Left Hand, Right Hand, Macmillan, London, 1950. Pages 189 to 91. Record painter Walter Sickert's claim to have lived in lodgings formerly occupied by the killer, a veterinary student who died in Bournemouth. Smith, Henry, From Constable to Commissioner, The Story of 60 Years, most of them misspent, 137, p. Chatto and Windus, London, 1910. Smith was Chief Superintendent of Police in the City of London 1885-90 and includes details of the Ripper City murder and of a rendezvous with a suspect. Snyder, Louis Leo and Morris, Richard Brandon, editors, Treasury of Great Reporting, Literature Under Pressure from the 16th Century to Our Time, 784, p. Simon and Schuster, New York, 1949. Includes Times article by John Williams, I Sent You Half a Kidney. Southern Guardian, Wimborne, UK, issue for January 5, 1889. Carried inquest report on suspect Druitt. Sparrow, Gerald, Crimes of Passion, 154, p. Barker, London, 1973. Pages 90 to 8 carry a thoroughly slipshod rehash of the Clarence theory with at least 15 mistakes in 4 pages. Spectator, London, July 27, 1889. Pages 107 to 8. False clues. Quotes a New York Herald article about a sailor suspect and concludes it is hoped that others will act on a less simple and easy assumption than that of hunting for a man who will fit their theories. In its March 7, 1891 issue, pp. 335-6, The Whitechapel Murder suggests that Francis Coles was a Ripper victim and that he would have remained equally undetected in Paris, Vienna, or New York. Spicer, Robert Clifford, I Caught Jack the Ripper in Daily Express, London, March 16, 1931. He arrested a doctor who was released by Spicer's police superiors. Spearing, Frank Prince Jack, The True Story of Jack the Ripper, 192, p. Doubleday, New York, 1978. A careless elaboration of Stowell's theory. Jack was the Duke of Clarence 366, but J.K. Stephen wrote the letters. No sources are quoted for many significant statements. Springfield, Lincoln. Some Peakant People, 287, p. Fisher Unwin, London, 1924. Claimed that the finger was leveled at Leather Apron by Harry Dam, a journalist on the Star, and that when Pizer was released from custody they headed off any libel suit by paying him £10. Being little more than a pound a murder. Stephen, Leslie. The Life of Sir James Fitz James Stephen, a judge of the High Court of Justice, by his brother. 504, p. Smith, Elder, London, 1895. Includes a chapter on James Stephen. Stewart, William. Jack the Ripper, A New Theory, 223, p. Quality Press, London. Saunders, Toronto, 1939. Argued that the Ripper was a woman. The second major book on the theme. Stowell, Thomas E. A Jack the Ripper, A Solution, in The Criminologist, London, November 1970. Announced that the murders were committed by S. the heir to power and wealth. Subsequent reports suggested that S was the Duke of Clarence, but Stawell denied this. Also discusses the clairvoyant Lee's story and recounts details about Sir William Gull, the royal physician. Stawell, Thomas E.A. In a letter to the Times published on November 5, 1970, denied that Clarence was his suspect but repeated that he was a scion of a noble family. Stawell died on the previous day and his son destroyed the Ripper papers, according to the Times of November 14. Sunday Chronicle, Manchester, of February 6, 1949. She was a decoy to catch Jack the Ripper. Concerns Mrs. Amelia Brown, a police whistle, and a rope dropped over the wall of the London hospital. Simons, John the Great Beast, The Life and Magic of Aleister Crowley, 413 p. MacDonald, London, 1971. A previously unpublished note on p16 says the Victorian worthy in the case of Jack the Ripper was no less a person than Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Not unnaturally, Simons describes the notion as preposterous. Simons, Julian Gustav, Crime and Detection, An Illustrated History from 1840 288 p. Studio Vista, London, 1966. 2 pages with illustrations. American edition entitled A Pictorial History of Crime, Crown, New York, 1966. Simons, Julian Gustav, The Criminal Classes. A chapter in Rule Britannia, The Victorian World, 255 p. Times Newspapers, London, 1974, edited by George Perry and Nicholas Mason. 2 pages on the Ripper including several pictures. Claim 6 murders. Thomson, Basil, The Story of Scotland Yard, 324 p. Grayson, London, 1935. Page 178 mentions the case and reports that CID officers suspected an insane Russian doctor who committed suicide in 1888. Thorwald, Jurgen, The Marks of Cain, 239 p. Thames and Hudson, London, 1965. Pages 65-6 record the principal facts and the McCormick theory. Time, New York, Who Was Jack the Ripper? November 9, 1970 p. 29. Speculation on the Clarence supposition. The Times, London, the index for 1888-9 has a series of relevant entries. The Times of November 4, 1970 p. 12. Court circular clears Clarence. A loyalist on the staff at Buckingham Palace cites court circulars which suggest that Albert Victor Edward was otherwise engaged at the times of the murders. The Times of August 16, 1973. New Ripper previews an episode of the BBC television series in which Joseph Sickert accuses Sir William Gull of political murders. 2 more horrible murders in the East End, 1888. Broadsheet reproduced in Colin. 2 Worlds, London, February 21, 1959. Medium solved Britain's vilest murders. The Lee's Story. Umpire, Manchester, July 31, 1910 p2. Who was Jack the Ripper? Dr. Forbes Winslow appeared before Bow Street magistrate Mr. Marsham on behalf of William Grant, an Irish medical student turned cattle boat fireman, who had served a prison sentence for wounding a Whitechapel woman. The article implied that London 368 solicitor George Kebble had appeared for Grant at his preliminary hearing and had later announced not only that Grant was the Ripper but that he died in prison. Winslow reported receipt of a confession from the Melbourne former fiancée of the Ripper, who had also denounced said her beloved to the Australian police, with the result that Jack emigrated to South Africa. Interviewed after the hearing, Winslow gave his suspect as an epileptic maniac who wore Canadian snowshoes for quietness. Vincent, William, Jack the Ripper in the Police Review, London, December 16, 1977 to April 14, 1978. A detailed review of the main facts and theories concludes that they amount to very little. Volta, Ornella the Vampire, translated from the Italian by Raymond Rudolph, 160 p. Tandem, London, 1965. claims 9 murders for the Ripper between 1887 to 9, most of her other facts are equally shaky. He showed a surrealist sense of composition in arranging intestines. Walbrook, H. M. Murders and Murder Trials 1812 to 1912 366 P. Constable, London, 1932. Surveys the known facts. Warden, Rob, and Groves, Martha, editors, Murder Most Foul and Other Great Crime Stories from the World Press, Ohio UP, Chicago, 1980. A chapter reprints the Times reports on the death of Annie Chapman. Warren, Charles. Sir Charles Warren defends the force in Pall Mall Gazette and the Daily News on October 4, 1888. The Commissioner of Police replies to the Whitechapel District Board of Works. Weisskopf, J.S. Jack the Ripper in History Makers, London, January 16, 1870 pages 432-5. Summary of the case, no theories but 2 contemporary posters. Wensley, Frederick Porter. 40 Years of Scotland Yard, the record of a lifetime service in the Criminal Investigation Department. 312 p. Garden City Pub Co., New York, 1930, published in England as Detective Days Castle, London, 1931. Describes the near capture of the murderer of Francis Coles and speculates that this may have been the Ripper. White, Jerry. Rothschild Building, Life in an East End Tenement Block, 1887-192-0301 P. History Workshop Series. Routledge, London, 1980. Claimed that large-scale redevelopment was Jack the Ripper's most important legacy. The Whitechapel Murders or the Mysteries of the East End NOS 1-5, incomplete, 40 P. Purkis, London, 1888. A strange collection of fact and fantasy preserved in the John Johnson collection of the Bodleian Library. Whittington Egan, Richard A. Casebook on Jack the Ripper 174 P. Wildley, London, 1976. Reprints the Contemporary Review articles and extends the coverage through to 1975. An interesting review of the literature. Whittington Egan, Richard. The Identity of Jack the Ripper in Contemporary Review, London, November 1972 pages 239-43, December 1972 pages 317-21, January 1973 pages 13-18, 24. Surveys the main theories. Who was Jack the Ripper, in Crimes and Punishment, London, number 17 July 1975 pages 455-70. Discusses the facts and major theories. Well illustrated. Authoritative, as befits a magazine which employed Joe Gott, Robin Odell, Donald Rumbelow, and Colin Wilson. Williams, Guy R. The Hidden World of Scotland Yard. 270 P. Hutchinson, London, 1972. Pages 28-33 have a brief note on Commissioner Warren's fate and several pictures from contemporary journals. Williams, Montague Round London, Down East and Up West. 387 P. Macmillan, London, 1892. Describes his visits to a penny peep show in the Whitechapel Road showing wax models of the Ripper victims. Williams, What Can Win the Life of General Sir Charles Warren, by his grandson. 450 P. Blackwell, Oxford, 1941. Pages 221-2 have an unreliable account of murders. Denies that all the victims were prostitutes, describes the Ripper as reticent, claims that Scotland Yard received 1,200 letters daily. Warren's bloodhound test seen as very successful but claims that no murders took place when the bloodhounds were in London. Favors the doctor theory of Griffiths. Williamson, Linda R. J. Lees, Did He Find Jack the Ripper, in Two Worlds, London, July 1986. The Most Repeated Ripper Yarn Repeated Again. Wilson, Colin A. Casebook of Murder. 288 P. Fruin, London, 1969, Cowles, New York, 1970. Good Arguments Against Existing Propositions. Ascribes a suicidal tendency to the killer indicated by destruction of the womb. Disposes of Odell and Stewart arguments by suggesting that the essence of the sadistic crime is the fantasy beforehand, and fantasy flourishes in a vacuum. The most imaginative approach so far. Wilson, Colin. A Criminal History of Mankind, 702 p. Granada, London, 1984. Several references to the Ripper, claims that the Victorians were only dimly aware that these were sex crimes. Wilson, Colin. The Duke and the Ripper in Books and Bookman, London, December 1972, pages 92-3. A commentary on the Stephen and Druitt theories based on Harrison and Farson. Wilson, Colin. My Search for Jack the Ripper series in Evening Standard, London, 8-12 August 1960. Gives the Matters, Adam, and McCormick theories. Reprinted in Unsolved 240p. Xanadu Publishers, London, 1987. Wilson, Colin. The Occult 601p. Hodder, London, 1971. Footnote to p. 446 accuses Volta, QV, of wild inaccuracies. Wilson, Colin. Order of Assassins, The Psychology of Murder, 242p. Hart Davis, London, 1972. Reprints Leicester Chronicle article and comments on the Riley theory. Wilson, Colin. Rasputin and the Fall of the Romanovs, 240p. Barker, London, Farrar Straus, New York, 1964. L. E. Kerr, QV, claimed to have read a manuscript dictated in French by Rasputin and recovered from his cellar, giving the facts behind the Ripper murders. According to Wilson, Rasputin had neither cellar nor French. See pages 204-6. Wilson, Colin. Was the Ripper the highest in the land? In Leicester Chronicle of January 28, 1971, pp. 14-15. Alabo rates on Stowell's theories and confirms that the Duke of Clarence was suspect. Prefers Colin's view. Wilson, Colin, and Pittman, Patricia. Encyclopedia of Murder, 576p. Barker, London, 1961. Summary of the main suggestions then on offer about the Ripper's identity. Winslow, Littleton Stewart. Forbes Recollections of 40 Years, being an account at first hand of some famous criminal lunacy cases. Owsley, London, 1910. Chapter on the Ripper. Author offered many suggestions to the police, including replacement of Whitechapel police by attendants experienced with lunatics. Records the story that Jack was a gorilla. Winslow received several Ripper letters and decided that he was a well-to-do man living near St. Paul's and suffering from religious mania. Claimed to have stopped the murders by publishing his clues. Woodhall, Edwin Thomas. Crime and the Supernatural, 282p. Long, London, 1935. Chapter 4 has yet another version of the Lees theory. Woodhall, Edwin Thomas. Jack the Ripper, or When London Walked in Terror, 96p. Mellifont Press, London, 1937. Pulp paperback which presents Jill the Ripper as Olga Chkersov revenging the death of her prostitute sister, adds another rehash of the Lees story, then lifts Matters theory. Reaches new heights in a tour de force account of the escape and suicide of a suspect based on a misunderstanding of 5 lines of Macnaghten. Wolfen, Eric. Der Sexual Verbrecher, An Handbook für Juristen, Verwaltungsbeamt und Art, Berlin, 1922. 11 Murders committed between 1887-9 as a surrogate for the sexual act. Yallop, David. A Deliver Us from Evil, 375p. MacDonald Futura, London, 1981. This book on the Yorkshire Ripper includes 5 pages outlining Jack's career. 372 Fiction and Drama, a selection and attempt has been made in my published bibliography, listed earlier, to record as many of the fictional variations on the Ripper theme as possible. A small selection of the more interesting and accessible items is given below. Alexander, David. Terror on Broadway, 243p. Random, New York, 1954, Boardman, London, 1956. Jack, Call Me Waldo, on Times Square. Alexander, Carl Time After Time 320p Granada, London, 1980. The book of the film in which Dr. Leslie John Stevenson, alias Jack, is sent into eternity by H.G. Wells. An imaginative idea, involving time travel, but in the end it doesn't really work. The film, same title, was released in 1979 with Malcolm McDowell as H.G. Wells chasing David Warner as Jack. Directed and written by Nicholas Meyer. Baring Gould, William S. Sherlock Holmes, A Biography of the World's First Consulting Detective 284p. Hart Davis, London, 1962. Chapter 15 tells how Holmes, in drag, is almost killed by the Ripper but is rescued by Watson in the nick of time. Revealed as Inspector Athelney Jones. Barnes, Peter the Ruling Class, A Baroque Comedy 115p Heinemann, London, 1969. This splendid play has Jack Gurney spreading his time between the streets of Whitechapel and the House of Lords. First performed in 1968, it appeared in film version in 1972, with Peter O'Toole as Jack. Barry, John Brooks The Michaelmas Girls 262p Deutsch, London, 1975. The Ripper teams up with a procuress. Block, Robert The Night of the Ripper 240p Doubleday, New York, 1984, Robert Hale, London, 1986. Jack and Jill the Ripper emerge from an intricately woven tale involving all the main protagonists. 373J. Block, Robert A. Toy for Juliet in Ellison, Harlan, editor, Dangerous Visions. Jack as an involuntary time traveler provides a solution to the Marie Celeste mystery in passing. Block, Robert Yours truly, Jack the Ripper in his The Opener of the Way Arksome House, Sauk City, USA, 1945. An ageless Ripper stalks his 88th victim in contemporary Chicago. Originally published in Weird Tales, 1943. Borowitz, Albert the Jack the Ripper Walking Tour Murder 256p St. Martin, New York, 1986. Boucher, Anthony Jack L. Distripater in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, New York, 1945, reprinted in Alan Barnard's The Harlot Killer. Burroughs, William S. Nova Express 251p Grove, New York, 1962. Tax murder notes are cut into the text, p. 45. Sendrars, Blaise Moravagin 1926, translation published by Peter Owen, London, 1968. A chapter entitled Jack the Ripper has Moravagin extending his musical scope as the Ripper in Berlin. Chaplin, Patrice by Flower and Dean Street and the Love Apple Duckworth, London, 1976. Jack returns as an advertising jingle writer. Chetwynd Hayes, R. The Gatecrasher in his The Unbidden 224p Tandem, London, 1971. An uninvited guest at a séance. Desmond, Hugh Death Let Loose 189p Wright and Brown, London, 1956. The Ripper story retold with the Chief of Police in a leading role. Dibdin, Michael The Last Sherlock Holmes Story Cape, London, 1978. Holmes finishes the Ripper and Moriarty at a stroke. Ellison, Harlan the Prowler in the City at the Edge of the World in Ellison, Harlan, editor, Dangerous Visions. Volume 1 359p Doubleday, New York, 1967, David Bruce and Watson, London, 1970. Sequel to Block's A Toy for Juliet. Farmer, Philip Jose A Feast Unknown 286p. Essex House, New York, 1969, Quartet, London, 1975. The Son of Jack. Gardner, John The Return of Moriarty Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1974. Druitt as the Ripper, disposed of through the good offices of Professor Moriarty. Gordon, Richard. The Private Life of Jack the Ripper, a novel, 279p. Heinemann, London, 1980. Dr. Bertie Randolph anesthetizing his victims before performing surgery. Pretty feeble. Greer, Terence. Ripper, 1973. A musical staged at the Half Moon Theatre in East London featuring a series of rippers. Hagen, Orlean. Whodunit? A Guide to Detective, Mystery, and Suspense Fiction, 834p. Boker, New York, 1969. The most fruitful source of fictional rip rana. Hatherley, Frank. The Jack the Ripper Show and How They Wrote It, 1973. A British musical, with music by Jeremy Barlow, in which the killer changes with each performance. Heine, Maurice. Regards Servenfer Anthropoclassique in Minot or, Paris, No. 8, 1936, pages 41 to 45. The Ripper, disguised as a vicar, in conversation with the Marquis de Sade and others. Keating, HRF. The Sheriff of Bombay, an Inspector Goad novel. Collins, London, 1984. A modern Indian Jack the Whipper, very much the same as the British fellow. Law, John. In Darkest London, London, 1889. Deathbed Confession of the Ripper as a Slaughterhouse Worker. Lovesey, Peter. Swing Together, 190p. Macmillan, London, 1976. A former Ripper suspect is suspected of 2 further murders, or was he the intended victim? Good period flavor. Lowndes, Marie Belloc. The Lodger. Scribner, New York, 1911, Methuen, London, 1913, and many editions since. A best-selling novel which first appeared as a short story in McClure's magazine, January 1911, pp. 262-77, and was reprinted by Barnard in that form. The classic of Ripper fiction, it inspired several films. Alfred Hitchcock's The Lodger, A Story of the London Fog, 1926, starring Ivor Novello. The Lodger, 1932, directed by Maurice Elvey, released in the USA as The Phantom Fiend. The Lodger, 1944, directed by John Brom, with Laird Krieger as the killer, and The Man in the Attic, 1953, directed by Hugo Fragance, with Jack Palance as Jack. A 2-act opera, The Lodger by Phyllis Tate, was first performed in 1960 and televised in 1964. Oliver, N.T. The Whitechapel Mystery, Jack the Ripper, A Psychological Problem, 225p. Continental Pub Co., Chicago, 1891. Number 8 of the bi-weekly Patrol Detective series according to the title page. John Dewey, a New York policeman, tracks down Drive Westinghouse, the Ripper, in London and becomes his accomplice. Perry, Michelle, editor, Jack the Knife, Tales of Jack the Ripper, 160p. Mayflower, London, 1975. Anthology of Ripper Fiction. Worth seeking out. Pember, Ron, and Amarn, Dennis. Jack the Ripper, a musical play, 53p. French, London, 1976. Play with music by Pember, first presented at the Ambassadors Theatre, London on September 17, 1974. Montague Druitt as the villain, and magician. Queen, Ellery. Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper, 271p. Gollancz, London, 1967. Published in USA as A Study in Terror. Lancer, New York, 1966. Inspired by a film of that title. The Duke Did It. Reed, Leslie. The Stranger. A 3-act play staged at the Playhouse, New York, for 16 performances from February 12, 1945. Reed, Hugh Dulcie. In the Fourth Penn Book of Horror Stories, 271p. Penn, London, 1963. The murderer collects heads for his mantelpiece. Russell, Ray. Unholy Trinity, 141p. Bantam, New York, 1967, Sphere, London, 1971. Sagittarius, the third novella of the trilogy, proceeds via Stevenson's Mr. Hyde/Jack the Ripper, through a reincarnation or disciple of Bluebeard. Shoe, Edward Spencer, Hand of the Ripper, 160p, Sphere, London, 1971. The book of the film Hands of the Ripper, 376, 1971, directed by Peter Sasti. This is a splendid film and it would be a shame to reveal the killer. Stevens, Shane, by reason of insanity, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, 1979. Thomas Bishop pursues a Ripper-style career in modern America. Or does he? Tapper, Oscar, Jack the Knife, Elam, London, 18p, 2nd edition, 1970. Verse drama first published in East London Arts Magazine autumn 1964 and performed April 1965. Thomas, Donald the Ripper's Apprentice, 245p, Macmillan S., London, 1986. A fictionalized life of Thomas Neil Cream, and very good of its kind. Cream makes a full eye confession. Tro, M.J. The Adventures of Inspector Lestrade, 224p. I. Macmillan, London, 1985. The Ripper as Melville MacNacton's daughter, but of course. Vachel, Horace Annesley, The Lodger. Play produced at Marine Elliott Theatre, New York from January 8, 1917 for 56 performances. Adapted from the Lowndes One novel and starring Lionel Atwill as the innocent lodger, J.V. Aine, c. Horror, 160p. Brown, Watson, London, 1962. The Ripper is a frustrated clergyman encouraged by his mum. Walsh, Ray, The Mycroft Memoranda, 186p. Deutsch, London, 1984. Holmes seeks his man. A. Watson did it? Wedekind, Frank der Erdgeist, 1895 and Die Beichte Pandora, 1904. Two plays by the German dramatist translated as Earth Spirit, 1914 and Pandora's Box, 1918, both published in New York. New translation by Stephen Spender, Vision, London, 1952. The heroine is murdered by the Ripper. Adapted by film director G.W. Pabst as Pandora's Box, Lulu, 1922, starring Louise Brooks and with Gustav Dieslow as the Ripper. The screenplay was published by Lorimer, London, in 1971. Alban Berg's unfinished opera Lulu had its premiere in 1937 and was released on record in 1952. Wilson, Colin, Ritual in the Dark, 416p. Gollancz, London, Houghton, Boston, USA, 1960. Ripper in a contemporary setting. Films, television, and radio. I have tried to round up most of the films, as well as the TV and radio programs on the theme in my bibliography. A few of those not already mentioned are, Jekyll and Sister Hyde, 1972. Hammer film written by Brian Clemens and directed by Roy Ward Baker. Martine Beswick Does Her Thing. Jack the Ripper, 1958. Mid-century film, distributed by Regal Films, featuring Lee Patterson and directed by Robert S. Baker. The screenplay by Jimmy Sangster was based on a story by Peter Hammond and Colin Craig. Jack the Ripper, 1973. BBC television dramatization in 6 parts, July 13 to August 17, 1973, has Detective Chief Superintendent Sparlow and What in pursuit of the Ripper after having given him 85 years start. Introduces the Freemason theory and attempts to link the Cleveland Street scandal with the painter Sickert and the murders. Murder by Decree, 1980. English film by John Hopkins, directed by Bob Clark and based on the Sickert story. Christopher Plummer is Sherlock Holmes, James Mason is Watson. Highlight theatrical productions. Smiler with a Knife. A documentary program about the murders broadcast by BBC Radio on April 12, 1967. Written by Tony van den Berg. Study in Terror, 1965. Based on a story by Donald and Derek Ford and starring John Neville as Holmes. Directed by James Hill. Georgia Brown singing makes it all worthwhile. Who was Jack the Ripper? BBC radio program in the Other Victorian series broadcast on June 1, 1972. Written by Mitchell Raper, the text was later, 1974, published by the Tabaret